You ever wonder what it feels like to live under a shadow you can't escape? To walk out your own front door and know the world waiting for you is built to keep you down? That's where this story begins. Welcome, I'm Mark Joie, and you're watching Injustice Browin. If you haven't yet, go ahead and hit subscribe because this story, like many others, demands to be heard, and I want to hear what you think in the comments. This isn't just history. It's life. It's the early 1950s, a small town in the American South. The kind of place where every face on the street knows your name, but not always with kindness. Meet the Harris family. James Harris wakes up before the sun rises, like clockwork, to head out for his job as a janitor at the local courthouse. It's not a glamorous job. It's not one that pays well. But James takes pride in it, pride in bringing home something honest to his wife and to kids. Sarah, his wife, keeps the house spotless, making sure there's warmth in their small wooden home, even when the nights feel cold and heavy. Their son, David, just 10 years old, goes to a segregated school a few blocks away, where the desks are old, the textbooks are tattered, and the teachers do the best they can with what little they have. David dreams bigger than that. School can offer. He dreams of a world beyond these streets, beyond the invisible lines drawn around their lives, but outside their door. The world isn't built for dreams. It's built for walls you can't see but feel every day. There's a separate water fountain down the block, just for black folks. Separate entrances to stores, separate benches, separate everything. The Jim Crow laws aren't just words in a book, they're the law of life here. James tries not to let it wear on him. He keeps his head down, works hard, and smiles when he can. But every day brings small cut-size that lingered along with suspicion, whispered threats. Behind closed doors, a policeman's stare that feels like a warning. The neighbors aren't all kind either. Some white families glance over with a mix of fear and hate, ready to protect their place by pushing the Harris family to the edge. Sarah watches all this with quiet worry. She holds the family together with soft words and steady hands, but the worry lines are deep. She knows that just one mistake, one wrong look, could bring trouble. She's seen it happen before in this town, to families just like theirs. David doesn't fully understand yet, but he feels it too, the tension, the fear that simmers just below the surface. His school books don't tell him about the world outside their town, but he hears the stories at church, from his parents, from neighbors. Stories of men who fought for freedom, only to find new chains waiting for them. Every Sunday, the family goes to church, the one place where their voices rise strong, and hope seems a little louder. But even in the house of God, the world's rules don't disappear. They sit in the back pew, eyes on the door, knowing that outside, the world still waits, cold and unforgiving. One evening, after dinner, James takes a walk down the street. It's a habit just to clear his head after a long day. He nods to a few neighbors, tips his hat politely, but on this night, something changes. A white man across the street steps out, eyes narrowed, lips tight. A policeman watches from the shadows nearby. No words are exchanged, but the silence is heavy with threat. Suddenly, James is stopped, grabbed roughly by the arm. The policeman accuses him of theft, a charge with no proof, no witnesses, just a quick decision made on a dark street. James protests, his voice calm but firm. "I ain't done nothing wrong," he says. But the policeman doesn't listen. The handcuffs click tight. Sarah hears the news before James makes it home. The children cling to her as the world they knew begins to crack. The house feels smaller, colder, like the walls themselves are closing in. This arrest isn't just about one night. It's about the whole system, the unfair laws, the eyes that watch. The voice is that silence. It's about a family caught in the crosshairs of a town that refuses to change. And as James is taken away in the back of a police car, the Harris family's quiet life shatters. Their dreams, their hope, and their peace hang in the balance, because sometimes injustice doesn't just knock at your door, it kicks it down without warning. But this is only the beginning. They say the truth will set you free, but what happens when the truth isn't enough? When the world around you doesn't want to hear it? When the scales of justice aren't just unbalanced, they're broken? Welcome back. This is Mark Joie with Injustice Browin. If you're watching, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts below. These stories, hard as they are, they need voices like yours. After James Harris was hauled away that cold night, his family waited. They waited for a chance to tell their side. They waited for the law to do what it promised, to be fair. But in that courtroom, fairness was the last thing on anyone's mind. The trial began in the small town's courthouse. The Same one where James had spent years cleaning floors, now the stage for his fate. The judge wore a face of stern authority, but it wasn't one of justice. It was the face of a system built to keep people like James locked in place. The prosecutor didn't just argue the case. He attacked James's character and invisible. Verdict of guilt handed down before a single word was spoken. No evidence connected James to the crime he was accused of. No witnesses stepped forward to say they saw him, but none of that mattered. The jury, made up entirely of white men, saw only a black man who dared to walk freely at night in their town. They heard the whispers, the rumors, and made up their minds long before the trial began. Sarah sat in the courtroom, clutching her children's hands like a lifeline. Her heart beat loud in her chest as she watched the man she loved fight a battle. No one thought he could win. Her voice, once so strong at home, was silent here, drowned out by the gavel's cold rhythm and the judge's harsh words. David watched too, his young eyes wide with confusion and fear. The man who had always been his hero, the man who taught him to stand tall and dream big, now seemed fragile, trapped behind bars of a system designed to crush him. The trial was swift. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, harsh. James Harris was sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. The courtroom echoed with a silence heavier than any scream. Sarah refused to give up. She spoke to lawyers, pleaded with officials, tried to make anyone listen. But doors closed in her face. The law was a cold machine, grinding on without mercy. Every attempt to appeal was met with delay, dismissal, or worse, threats. The neighborhood whispered their fears. To speak up was to invite trouble. Friends stopped visiting. The church's prayers felt powerless. The very air around the Harris family thickened with loneliness and despair. For David, the loss was a wound that never healed. Without his father, the world felt colder. At school, other children asked why his dad wasn't there. Some didn't ask at all, they just whispered behind his back. The pride he once carried slowly turned to anger, a fire growing inside him that he didn't know how to control. Every night, Sarah sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty chair where James used to sit. Her hands trembled with exhaustion and fear, but also with determination. She would carry this burden for her family. She would keep their story alive. But beneath it all, there was rage at a system that punished innocence and had rewarded prejudice, rage at a town that looked the other way when truth was twisted, rage at a future stolen before it had a chance to bloom. The Harris family's life was shattered, their dreams deferred, their hearts heavy with grief. But even in that darkest hour, the embers of resistance smoldered quietly, because sometimes when injustice hits hardest, it also lights the fire that won't be put out. The fight was far from over. It's a strange thing how silence can carry a kind of strength, not the loud kind that shakes windows, but the quiet kind that bends without breaking. David Harris learned that strength from his mother. Welcome back. I'm Mark Joie, and this is Injustice Browning. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe and tell me what small acts of courage you've seen in your own life, because sometimes it's the smallest sparks that light the darkest nights. David grew up carrying a weight most kids his age never knew. His father was gone, behind bars for a crime he never committed. His mother was his rock, steady and unyielding. She never let him forget who he was or where he came from. Your father was a good man, she'd say, and so are you. Don't ever let them tell you otherwise. School was a battlefield. The classrooms were cramped and underfunded. The textbooks were outdated, some pages torn out. But David was hungry to learn. Every book was a window to a world beyond segregation and fear. Reading became his rebellion. Every word he devoured was a step away from the life designed for him, a step toward his own kind of freedom. Outside school, the town still bore its scars. Job opportunities were scarce, and those that existed came with conditions David's mother warned him about. Keep your head down, she'd say. Work twice as hard, and still they'll treat you like less. David saw it firsthand. Men with more qualifications denied work because of their skin. Women turned away from stores, forced to use separate entrances. The daily indignities, small slights, harsh words, suspicious glances were constant reminders. That equality was still a distant dream, but David refused to be invisible. He watched, he listened, and he learned. At church meetings and community gatherings, he heard stories of people fighting back, quiet protests, boycotts, marches that rippled through the South like a rising tide. These stories gave him hope, a reason to believe that change was possible. With his mother's blessing, David started organizing. It began small, a few young men and women meeting after church, talking about their dreams and their rights. They shared books, ideas, and stories of courage from places they'd never been. They discussed how to challenge the everyday injustices without losing themselves to anger or fear. David became a voice for those who felt they had none. When a local employer refused to hire black workers, David spoke up. When a school official dismissed their concerns about the textbooks, David stood his ground. His words weren't loud or angry. They were steady, filled with the quiet confidence his mother taught him. He knew the road ahead was long. The town's walls were high, built over decades of fear and hate. But every time David faced a closed door, he looked back at the stories his father had told him of dignity, strength, and the power of education. Those stories were seeds, and David was ready to plant them in the soil of his community. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Some called him troublemaker, others called him hopeful. But David didn't let the name sting. He knew that the fight for justice often begins in the small moments, in the courage to speak, in the will to learn, in the refusal to accept a life less than what's deserved. Each day, David walked the streets of his town with his head held high, carrying the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow, because he understood something his father had taught him long ago. Resilience isn't about never falling. It's about rising again and again, even when the world tries to keep you down. And in that rising, there is hope. The road to justice isn't a straight line. It twists, it turns, and it demands everything you have. For David Harris, the fight that started in whispers grew into a battle that would shape not just his family's future, but the future of his community. Welcome back. I'm Mark Joie with Injustice Browning. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment, because this story isn't just about the past. It's about how courage can change what comes next. Years passed. David grew into a man shaped by the fires of his childhood, by loss, by rage, by quiet acts of resistance. He put himself through law school, driven by a single purpose: to fight the system that had broken his family, to fight for justice where none seemed to exist. The day came when a case landed on his desk that felt like history repeating itself. A young black man, accused on flimsy evidence, facing a town still riddled with fear and prejudice. The same courthouse where his father once worked now echoed with the footsteps of another fight. David took the case with a steady heart and a clear mind. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about one man. It was about all the families still waiting for their voices to be heard. The courtroom was a battlefield. The prosecution dug in, relentless, wielding the same tired accusations and biases David had heard all his life. Threats came not just to him, but to his family, to his community. Shadows loomed large, but David stood firm. There were setbacks. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were intimidated. The weight of history pressed down hard. But every time the system tried to push back, David found strength in the faces around him: the mother clutching her child, the neighbors who refused to stay silent, the quiet prayers from the back of the room. The trial stretched on, tension thick in the air. But then, moments came that cut through the darkness, when truth broke through lies, when courage outshone fear. David's voice rang clear as he called out injustice, piece by piece. His arguments were sharp, but beneath them was something sharper still: the story of a family shattered and reborn, the story of a community refusing to be broken. Finally, the verdict came. Not perfect justice, no, but real. The young man was acquitted, the charges dropped, and with it, the name of the Harris family was cleared, at least in the eyes of the law. It wasn't the end of the fight. The scars remained, the pain remained, but something powerful had shifted. David stood outside the courthouse that day, the weight of years on his shoulders, but his chin held high. Round him, people gathered not just to celebrate a legal victory, but to witness a moment of healing, of hope. He thought of his father, of the stories passed down through years of struggle. He thought of his mother's quiet strength, and he knew this was more than a win. It was a promise that justice, slow and imperfect, can still come. That resilience can break chains. And standing there, David Harris wasn't just a man who won a case. He was a symbol of how pain, when met with courage, can become power, of how a family torn apart by injustice can rise again, because sometimes justice doesn't come fast. Sometimes it comes through the steady, determined fight of those who refuse to let their story end in silence. And this family's story, is far from over. Justice is never handed down like a gift. It's earned piece by piece, through struggle and sacrifice, and sometimes the cost is more than a single lifetime can carry. This is Mark Joie with Injustice Browning. Before we close, take a moment with me to remember those whose stories don't always make the headlines. The quiet heroes who carried the weight of pain, the ones who fought in silence so others could speak louder, years after the courtroom battles and the protests. The Harris family gathered together. It was a simple afternoon, but heavy with meaning. They sat around worn chairs and a chipped table, faces marked by the years, eyes reflecting. A history that never quite fades. Their conversation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of what they'd endured hung in the air. A solemn reminder of the price they paid just to be seen as human. Sarah, now older, reached for a faded photograph of James. Her fingers trembled, not from age alone, but from the memory of everything lost and everything survived. He gave us the strength to keep going, she said quietly, even when it seemed like the world wanted to break us. David looked around at his own children, at the young faces full of questions and promise. He thought of the legacy he wanted to leave, not just the victories in court, but the lessons of resilience, courage, and dignity. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. He told them, their fight is our fight. Their pain is our reminder. There's a truth in that the past doesn't stay buried. It shapes us. It haunts us, but it also guides you as the stories of injustice, the moments of loss, and the sparks of resistance. They are threads woven into the fabric of who we are. And the fight, it's far from over. Each generation carries a new burden, a new hope. Justice is not something that comes once and stays. It's a promise we have to keep again and again. So here's the call. Remember, speak out, stand up. The stories of those who came before us, like James, like Sarah, like so many unnamed, deserve more than silence. They deserve action. They deserve change. Because justice isn't a finish line. It's a journey, and it's one we all have to walk. The past is heavy, but the future is ours to shape. Hold that weight with care and keep moving forward.